Tell me about the book.
Oh, okay. It's a book I've wanted to write really for the last 20 years. I just didn't get around to it. I actually started writing it when I began my postdoc, but I couldn't continue. The idea is it's about evolution of control systems. There's a very classic idea in psychology, and you've heard me criticize this before, of this kind of serial model where you build knowledge about the world, then you make decisions, and then you act out in the world. It's very much based on the cognitive revolution from the 50s, very much inspired by artificial intelligence research. And in my opinion, it leads us to the wrong questions to ask about the organization of the brain, because that's not what the brain evolved to do. And it gets caught up in certain dead ends and mysteries that don't exist, like the question of meaning, for example, which is a insoluble problem in that tradition, that psychological tradition, as far as I can see, in that it hasn't been solved, and it's periodically confronted and abandoned, and confronted and abandoned, where from the perspective of a control theoretic view of the brain, it's just not a problem at all. It doesn't actually even appear as a problem, because meaning is always there in interaction. Interactions are, by their nature, have consequences that are good or bad, and that already imbues them with meaning. And the question is not, so the classic question in AI is, if we're doing symbolic reasoning, how does meaning get attached to symbols that we're manipulating? You probably know this stuff, the Searle's Chinese room framing problem of AI. It's a symbol grounding problem. That's a way of asking a question, but I think it's a bad question. And my colleague Giovanni Pizzullo wrote a paper in which he turns it around, and I totally agree with this same. We're on the same wavelength, Giovanni, that it's not how meaning gets attached to symbols, because meaning's been there from interactions from the earliest cells. Before there was a difference between physiology and behavior, there was interaction, and that interaction always is meaningful insofar as it benefits or hurts the organism. The question is not how meaning gets attached; it's how do you develop that control system, and how do symbols emerge within that system, and then how do they get detached in some way from the actual interaction? So he says it's not a symbol grounding problem; it's symbol detachment problem. It's how do you have a system where in the kind of system that you think about in the control theoretics or embodied cognition framework, the representations are all very interaction-centered. They're all about behavior. They're not about representing abstract knowledge about the world. It's like, where am I going to go now? What am I going to choose now? What are the payoffs of the things I'm considering right now? It's not learning the history of the ancient Greeks or something, which is not really tied into outcomes to me yet. But yet we are capable of doing. We are capable of talking to each other about abstract concepts that don't have any immediate payoff, that are just, we're able to, entertain ourselves by reading books about things that don't actually, there is something that we can do that's very cognitive, that the psychology addressed. And so, but the question, it's not how, again, it's how did those things develop within this meaningful interacting creature that we are. And so you read my 99 paper, yeah?
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, so that's where it all started, right? It was that idea. I mean, that paper just expresses the ideas that I've been exposed to, that to me define the real questions to ask. It's about control. How do you extend your control first into the world and then through other creatures in the world to benefit yourself and your environment? And so the book is essentially trying to reconstruct the foundations of cognitive neuroscience. It's kind of like re-examining the foundations of cognitive neuroscience from a different angle, not from the history of psychological thought, but the history of biological evolution that we actually have data about. So I took a sabbatical this year to read some of this stuff finally. I've been dying to read this stuff, and I've been reading it a lot. I mean, no, the book is far from being done. I've written pieces of chapters. I'm working primarily on one chapter, but I can already see I'm going to rewrite it entirely from scratch as I learn more stuff. I'm still not at that stage, but I am seeing better and better that the knowledge is there about the phylogenetic history. You know, like that slide I showed today. That summarizes a great deal of data, but it's all there. It's all available. You can go online to paleodb.org and get all the information about fossils you could possibly want. You can go to timetree.org and find the relationships between different species based on molecular data on their genetic code. And so we know, and it's, you know, there's controversies, all kinds of controversies always, but we have an emerging consensus about what the branch points are. Most of the branch points I showed today are not controversial at all. For now, we'll see. Somebody might find some new data, and something might switch. And so, if we can draw upon that, I guess my point is that there's all this data is out there, and the field of cognitive neurosciences seems to be perfectly comfortable with having ignored it. And I don't think that's a good strategy. I think not only the answers that we give to the questions we ask should be based on evolution, but the questions themselves should come from evolution. So it's not like, how does the brain attach meaning to symbols, or how does the brain store and retrieve knowledge? I don't think those are, they might turn out to be the right questions, but right now we ask them because of the history of our academic thinking. It's the history of my supervisor and their supervisor, et cetera. You know, it probably comes from Plato, but it shouldn't. Shouldn't be the history that we base our distinctions about. We should, I think, we should use essentially the evolutionary record, which is available with big gaps in it, but it is available, and use that to define the question. So we don't ask what is decision making. We ask, when the tectum appeared, what did it confer to animals? And the answer has to do something about decisions in reacting to threatening stimuli, perhaps. And that's a different kind of question, a different kind of answer. But I think it's one that's better grounded. So the book is going to be a couple of chapters that introduce why you'd want to do this, and then the subsequent chapters are organized essentially chronologically. The chapter I'm writing right now is the beginning of the story. It's going from first set multicellular animals to the early chordates. The next chapter is going to be the transition to vertebrates, then the transition to tetrapods, mammals, primates. I probably will have effectively a chapter for each of those stages, each referring to the previous ones, and trying to sort of discuss what was it that was, when the cerebral cortex grew so dramatically in mammals. What was it? Why? What did it confer? And why did it? Not so much the why question, actually. The why questions are tricky, but what actually happened? What did actually change? What behaviors actually did appear? Because that's something we actually can infer from the comparison between different species, as well as fossil record, etc. So I want to build a model, essentially, of control system, simple control system. The earliest chordate that's closest to that stem chordate that we still have around today is the amphioxus, which is a hypothalamus attached to a spinal cord and a little bit of a midbrain. There might be something like a tectum in there, as I suggested. It's all based on other people's work. And then that thing managed to survive for the last 700 million years because what it does is pretty effective. But other things got added on other lineages, like the telencephalon of the lamprey and vertebrate since, the cerebellum of sharks and everything since, and so on and so on. I think it can be done. A lot of people have already done parts of this. The last chapter on primates, I'm probably just going to, it's going to be probably very short. It's going to be probably just say, go read Passingham and Rice 2012, period. That's it, I'm done, because they seem to have really done that quite nicely. Although, we'll see if I still agree if they still read it. But it's out there. Not so much in my field, and so that's why I'm reading this stuff.
Are you getting the support you need for this, do you think?
Well, all the support I really need is time to do it.
Okay.
I have funds to run my lab. I have good people in my lab. I don't have a grant renewal coming up in the next couple of years, so I can be relatively relaxed. The university, it doesn't matter. They don't really, I have the freedom to do what I want with my time as long as I, teach and do my research. I can really only afford to spend a day or two per week on this. It's going to probably come down to 1 day per week now that my sabbatical is ending. But I think it's going to be many years before it's written. But I'm quite excited because I think I see what the shape of it will be. And I think I know where to go to fill in the pieces that I don't.
Paul, is the many years thinking time or the many years just carving out the writing time?
It's going to be, writing is not as long as the thinking and the reading. The biggest problem is that when you go into a new field, which this is for me, I'm like an undergraduate level in this, right? You go in, and at first, the questions just keep multiplying. Every question I think I get the handle on, I've got 3 more that I don't have a handle on. And it's just you just feel lost in the woods, right? And I was like that this summer when I was reading this stuff. But after a while, you start getting a handle of the same themes. You start to see what the shape of it is. Every once in a while, you find a nice summary by somebody who's already done that, and you can draw upon that. That's a good way. So there's a lot of that. That's a little bit hard to predict. The actual writing doesn't take very long.
If you could work on it full time, how long would it take you?
I could probably do it in a year or two if I could do it full time. Yeah, I think that's what. Well, I don't know because I've never written a book before. But Steve Wise, who is sort of my guide in this, he's written many books, very much like this. Like I said, Passing on Wise. And he, essentially shut down his lab and started writing books. Right. He puts them out about every 2 or 3 years, and they're pretty ambitious. So, if I was writing purely about stuff I know, it wouldn't be that long. The big problem is that I actually have to learn a lot of the material, and a lot of it is not all in one place, right? It's not like I can read everything one person has read and that connects me to all the things I'm trying to connect. It's a little bit hard. I've discovered particular sources for that early history stuff. Up until the lamprey, I feel pretty confident, right? But that's 550 million years ago, so I've got a long way to go to get to, primates. I don't know if I'll get to humans. I'd like to, because most readers would be most interested in seeing the link to humans. Yeah, but no, for good reason. For good reason. The problem with that is that we just have less data there. We have less data. There was really a lot of innovation along the human lineage, and between us and bonobos, it's only about 7 million years, but the cognitive gap is large, and primarily I think it's because of language. Language was one of those sparks that ignited and made a great advance in cognitive ability and cultural ability, and then feeding back into cognitive, that is hard to, it's hard to understand it with this kind of approach because we only have one animal that had that spark. Animals can do very interesting communications, but they're impressive until you compare them to human communication. And then human communication is just amazing. I have a 4-year-old son, as you know, and I'm already blown away by what he's able to do. It seems to me, frankly, watching him learn language, it's not possible to learn language. I can see why people like Chomsky and other linguists thought this was just this, it's just a different system, right? Because it is quite dramatic. But I don't believe it's a different system. I think somehow human brains, adapted the strategies of a monkey brain and made everything. Your iPad,
right.
with a caveman brain that was topologically quite similar to a monkey brain. It's an interesting question, but that's what people are asking. And so, I'll read their stuff too once I get to it.
What are you going to do with the cognitive, the whole higher order cognitive things? Are you going to continue? It sounds like today, based on the lecture, you're going to continue to try to integrate it and try to make sense of it in terms of your findings. And your models.
You mean trying to take it to high-level goal, like I was doing at the end of my talk?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I actually think that is useful, though, because, yes, I think I will continue doing that. I think it is actually useful because even for understanding a monkey, you really have to go way beyond what I've done so far. I mean, I'm studying very simple decisions. And I wonder if some of the monkeys in my lab are doing the tasks we do and think to themselves, this is an insult, to my intelligence. I'm capable of more than this, and they actually will show it.
And in the wild they are,
in the wild they
yeah.
are. But even in the lab, training a monkey is a bit of a battle of wits. And let me tell you, they are pretty good at the battle of wits. They can manipulate us as well as a 2-year-old can manipulate us pretty well too. So they are actually very good. Social interactions, they are pretty sophisticated, right? They don't have some of the tricks that we have up our sleeve because our ability to, frankly, again, simple detachment. We're able to take knowledge away from its context and manipulate it, and that probably largely through language. So there's a number of people that have made this point through the years. Marilyn Donald is one you may have read. They talk about this sort of ignition that happens when you once language became rich enough to cross the threshold of recursive syntax and this kind of fancy communication ability that we have. But their social interactions are pretty, they're pretty sophisticated. In a still kind of a brute force way. But yeah, I mean, so even to explain the monkey, we have to go beyond the kind of tasks we do. We have to do forward planning tasks. I mean, it'd be nice to do a study where, for example, like I showed in that example of a monkey on the tree branch thinking about going forward to make the. That'd be nice. Then we could study that in the lab. We could make a task where a monkey has things that are, let's say, out of reach, and he could press a pedal to move himself to put them in reach, and now it's one level of affordance away from, so it's the immediate affordances, and then there's the prediction of affordances that might be possible if I do a certain action. And if the action has predictable consequences, I don't see why they were not going to learn that. That's a trivial thing to learn. I press a pedal, my chair moves forward. Lots of animals can learn that kind of simple operant conditioning. So if we give them an environment where they can now predict affordances, it'd be interesting to see. Now what happens? Do you see competition between reaching and locomotion subsystems? And I would actually say maybe now basal ganglia will be involved in that kind of decision because it's a between system choice of behavioral subtype. But it also touches upon the idea of higher order planning, right? Now it becomes a planning thing. It becomes, do I exploit the thing that's near me, or do I put a little bit of work to get to this other thing that's not near me? It goes beyond the paradigms that a lot of people have done, where it's there's some effort. Although people in the rat world and mouse world are actually.
What about the birds? I've been reading a lot about birds.
Yeah, the problem for me about birds is since we diverged from them, they've traveled through so many niches.
Right, good point.
The solutions they've come up with are possibly not really informative. So I have a very human chauvinistic perspective.
Right.
I pursue the human branch, and I pick species based on how similar they are, how much they haven't changed since we diverged, right? So the ones that diverged from us, but then stayed within that niche and didn't evolve too much, are much better than ones that did something really amazing on their own after we separated. Because that's just going to cause confusion, right? Birds are amazing, but they are quite different. They diverged from like 350 million years ago, some estimates, right? Back then, neither we or the birds were doing anything of that sort. Right? So that might not actually help. That might actually just confuse the issue. I have very little that I look at Drosophila. We've already left those because I'm going on again, vertebrates, right?
So you really are trying to solve human cognition problems.
It really is about human. It is in the end about humans.
For you it is, yeah.
Yeah, for me it is. I'm following that line.
Yeah.
If fish feel insulted, let them write their own book. I'm working on human. For reasons that this is more interesting
Right.
to us, right? Now the human book might not actually get to humans, but I still think it's leading to maybe help understand it.
So you really do, in a sense, I mean, I have my own issues with it, but you really do want to try to address the issue of higher level cognitive.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, I do. I mean, well, certainly, I do. I'd love to address all of it, but
Right.
Strictly speaking, I can see that we have the data to address it at the level of primates.
Right.
And that's pretty damn good already.
Yeah.
Actually, right?
Yeah.
If we can do that, and we're not going to, right? We're not going to get there in my lifetime to be the kind of a satisfying theory
Right.
of non-human primate cognition. But if we can just sketch out the shape of it, I think then we're making good progress, right? Now, I could be wrong. I mean, it might be possible to infer some of the steps between the last primate, our last cousins and humans. It might actually be, and development is a big key here, because the big problem in the evolutionary construction is we've lost too many. There's been too much extinction. There's been, in the stem vertebrates, the Cambrian explosion. It's very sad. A lot of wonderful creatures just didn't make it. And how much would we know if the lamprey didn't make it? We would be lost without them, frankly, right? And so maybe we
But
did
there's
lose
still something in the brain that carried forward.
Oh, yes,
Okay.
of course. But my point is that reconstructing it is hard if we don't have the branch points, right? We don't actually have that many branch points that lead to us. And for the example of transitions between, apes and humans, that's it. There's nothing. There's chimps and bonobos are a branch that branched off of us about 7 million years ago, and since then we don't have that much. And human behavior 7 million years ago was not what it is now, and human brains have changed. But we do have development. We do have developmental studies that we can infer evolutionary stages from development. It's not like we can see the adult forms of animals.
You're saying as the human brain develops from childhood through.
Yes,
Okay.
Yes. We can see we can see a little bit. So if you look at development of species, they tend to share early stages of development with far related species, and later stages of development with more closely related species. And the reason for that is it's very straightforward. By the way, it's not a hard set rule. There's violations of this rule, but there's this very strong tendency. And the reason for it's very simple. That development is a little bit like a recipe. It's a step-by-step process, It's like cooking, You first boil the water, then you put in the pasta, You can't put in the pasta and then boil the water, right? There's certain stages that have to proceed, and of course it's much more complicated than cooking. There's certain stages, and the thing is that the stage 7 depends on certain assumptions about stages 1 through 6, right? So when evolution makes modifications, which can happen anywhere along that stream, they tend to not work out so well if they're in the early stages, right? If you've got a 12-stage recipe and you've decided to change stage 2, you're going to violate many of the assumptions under which stage 3, 4, all the way through 12 works, right? And so it's not a good bet. It's not likely to work. It's likely to be a creature that just doesn't. If you decide you're not going to fold your neural tube, forget it.
Right.
You're out of the game. You're stillborn, right? And so, and since mutations are distributed, throughout this thing, it's the ones at the end that tend to work out better, right? So terminal addition is the trend. Is a fairly strong trend in evolution. By no means the only one. There's all kinds of modifications that can happen. Changes in order, change in rates of certain kinds of processes. I'm actually only beginning to understand this stuff by reading it, but there is a tendency that you can infer a bit about evolution from development.
Is that phrase, ontogeny?
Recapitulates phylogeny.
Yeah.
Well, that's wrong, because that it would imply that adult forms are recapitulated their development, which is not true, right?
Okay.
You don't have an adult fish.
Right.
You have a early stage fish embryo, and then after that, you never have an adult fish that you're developing. There's no stage like that. But the early stage of your development is similar to the early stage of a fish development. So ontogeny does not recapitulate the phylogeny of adults.
Right.
It recapitulates what evolution is really doing is it's evolving new developmental programs, right? And so there is a trend, but it's not a recapitulation.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, that's the phrase and this was I think Haeckel, Ernst Haeckel, but it's not the case. But there is something that he was talking about. It was mostly a comparison of embryos of different species, and you've seen this kind of thing. The chick embryo, and the human embryo at certain stages, you wouldn't be able to tell me which one is which.
Right.
And again, that's because of terminal addition, the tendency for terminal addition and the developmental programs. It's violated sometimes, but that's usually relatively dramatically seen when you actually do the comparison of development. So I'm not the expert on this. I'm giving you what I read. But it's another potential guide for us to try to infer stages. So maybe we could infer a little bit more about the ape to human transition by looking at human development. But it's not something you want to do experimentally.
Right.
You don't want to mess with it with a child.
Right.
So you have to just observe. But there's a lot of work on this. There's a whole field of developmental neuroscience where people do this. People are doing this. And, once I get there, I'll read their work. There's a book did I ever mention to you Hendrik Jensen's book? Check it out. It's a bit of a bizarre book. It's a brilliant book. It's one of my
What's the title?
It's called Catching Ourselves in the Act. And it's written by someone called Horst Hendricks Janssen, who was a PhD student, like in his 50s, he decided to pursue a PhD after a long career in, engineering, I think. Decided to pursue a PhD. I think he did it with Maya Mataric, one of the sort of embodied behavior-based roboticists. Are you familiar with Rodney Brooks? You might like it. Anyway, Hendricks Janssen wrote a book it's a little bit about the book I want to write, except his is more of a critique His is more the critique. He points out that evolution really can only build things based on behaviors, and he draws a lot about there in his book about development, human development. He says that the only ontology that of the things that we should be studying, the questions we should be asking, comes from history, evolutionary and developmental. And so I'm doing the evolutionary part, but I think the development part, he's correct. He's looking at, how does the social interactions between mother and child develop, et cetera, and what does that tell us about the ability to, it's this linguistic ignition idea that there's this process that develops and the brain becomes very sophisticated thanks to, in part, having a culture around you that teaches you certain things, like language and interactions and all the complexities of culture. And it explains in a sense the kind of stunning thing that we have a Cro-Magnon brain doing, quantum physics and stuff,
And,
it's actually the same.
And pretty stupid things.
Yes, well, that's true. Yeah, pretty stupid things. Maybe more stupid things than brilliant things. But nevertheless, every once in a while.
Every once in a while.
Somebody, every once in a while there's a Shakespeare.
Right.
So, it's actually pretty impressive, right? Given what the brain actually evolved to do, the kinds of problems evolved to solve. And I think it's because the culture around us is giving us this rich domain for interactions, and the strategy just worked really well. The strategy of, I don't know what that strategy is yet, but it has probably something to do with language, and
well, there are improvements, lifespan.
Yeah, oh yeah.
I mean, dramatic.
Yeah. Well, a big thing happened with we're having 3 generations coexisting.
Right.
That was a big step for
Right.
humanity. But obviously civilization and not everybody having to do every aspect of survival.
Right.
Right. That
Right.
actually helps a lot.
Right.
And not having to worry about, really, I mean, we have to provide food for ourselves and our families, but I'm not after farming the land,
Right.
I mean, that would be it'd be difficult for Mozart to do what he did if he had to go.
But you're really, in a sense, you want to, how do you have, okay, in a very disciplined way, the Cro-Magnon brain with all of the lampreys,
Yeah.
stages and that, and get Mozart?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a wonderful question.
I'm not sure. Well, that one we made, I don't think, certainly in my lifetime that it will be answered. We have a strategy to move towards that, right? And I think again, people are already making pieces of the puzzle in different places. There are people who study very much the development of mother-child interactions and how that actually bootstraps. Piaget was saying a lot of the things that I'm saying.
Right.
Years
That's
ago.
true, yeah.
Action perception cycles. It's all about interaction.
Right.
Cognition is built from sensory-motor interactions. He was saying this, unfortunately, in really dense and incomprehensible prose. Unfortunately.
What are you going to do?
Yeah, well, Swiss. Even
Well,
that,
French.
yeah. But the insights were there. Many of the same
Yeah.
insights. And it pops throughout psychology. I mean, Piaget said it, but John Dewey said it 120 years ago
Paul, you could do a whole nother presentation.
on just the history.
What you're saying right now.
Oh yeah. Oh sure.
And you should.
I have done that. I gave a talk at UCAM.
It's not on
no,
YouTube.
it's not tape. No, it's not. I could give that talk again though. This was not the one that you saw. This was a small group of like 15 people. But it was about sort of the history of ideas and why we've sort of, I think we've been inheriting ideas because of our own history, despite the fact that they really weren't the right things.
You know who else is talking like this? Joe Ledoux. Have you heard Joe Ledoux?
Oh yeah, no, actually I didn't know that.
Joe Ledoux,
Really?
yeah, he's doing a good job.
Yeah.
He's rethinking the emotional brain.
Yeah.
Cool for him because he has to go back and say, hey, I was responsible for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. That's true. Yes, you're right. Well, which is the best actually, because he's established himself as an authority on this, so people will actually listen, presumably.
He's.
I should check out his newer stuff. I just know the old stuff. Yeah.
I think it's good.
Oh, good. Looking at evolutionary.
This all has to have survival value.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's the priority. The subjective experience of fear or emotions is irrelevant to the survival.
Well-
A whole new side of you, Paul. I am so glad I drove to St. Louis. You have got to give these lectures too. This will,
Feinberg and Mallett's book, though, is a beautiful example of building it on the evolutionary line, because Mallett knows all this. Really, it's very nice. It's a little bit. I find it was almost a pity that it was so much about consciousness. I've liked it to be about behavior, right? But they talk in that book. They talk a little bit about the evolution of emotional systems, and in my talk I said subpaleo amygdala appears in the sort of early fish stage before we diverge from teleost fish, and they developed that a little bit better. So the thing is, I wonder if what Ledoux says could then be put in that context of when these different things, because it's actually known. People know, or at least I wouldn't say no, right? But there is data that one could use to infer sequences of elaborations, that will inform that argument, I think, quite well. These systems actually there before it was a cerebral cortex. The limbic system was had precursors in certain parts of it. I probably would, and he probably would. He probably just hasn't had time to go and do that.
well, he's at the end of his career too.
Yeah, okay.
And so.
But that's the best time to speculate. Well,
The problem is the amygdala is so freaking complicated.
Well,
It's got like 7 cortices.
Yeah.
And who knows, there may be 58 cortices,
in fact, as far as I can tell from the stuff that I've been reading recently, the entire cerebral cortex plus basal ganglia is essentially a circuit that is extremely elaborate in one end of it, and in the other, but it has 2 poles. One is septal nuclei, and one is all converges into the amygdala. So the amygdala has a paleal sort of cortical part, and it has a subcortical basal ganglia part. It's like the forebrain in microcosm, you know. And so yeah, like you said, it's a complicated structure, and maybe assigning it a single role is a bit. Even though some people like me might say, well, you shouldn't study it until you understand the history, but we need to study it. So I'm not saying people shouldn't. Right? It's clinically relevant. I'm just saying that at the same time, while people study it, someone should also look at the history of it, because, you know, to that point yet, I'm still struggling with the lamprey.
Well, I saw that lamprey paper.
Oh, which one? The Grillner one. Yeah.
What is it, 700 million years? I'm like, holy cow.
Well, there's some question about it. You know, different people put the date. It's ancient. It's ancient. And you know, and the nice thing about the lamprey is they haven't changed them a lot. You know, at least 300 million years ago, there were fossils of lamprey that looked pretty much like modern lamprey. Yeah. So at least for that part, they haven't changed. Yeah. Which is good. They give us a good model of that stuff.
Right.
You know, and things get a little bit easier later. So we have, you know, once you get to mammals, you've got a lot of species to look at. And frankly, tetrapods.
So what's other people's work right now, and you mentioned some of it, that you like, that you're getting that's the most helpful for you?
Well, for the book, I'm reading stuff way outside my field. I can tell you that Luis Puelas is, to me, very enlightening work. This is a developmental studies of the brain that challenge the accepted view that the cerebral cortex is the sort of front tip. He suggests the hypothalamus is the front, and the entire telencephalon, including basal ganglia and the cerebral cortex, is just a mushroom that grew out of the alar portion of the caudal hypothalamus, right? So it's a subpart of the hypothalamus that just got really elaborate for good reason, right? And I think the reason had to do that it was solving a particular. So everything I think the brain is doing effectively is trying to satisfy the hypothalamus. It's trying to keep you warm and cozy, fed, and I mean I think a lot of people believe that. Right? The question is sort of what is the sort of functional hierarchies, and Puelas, unlike most textbooks that say, you know, that the top system is sort of the cortex, especially the frontal lobes, that's sort of high-level controller. He says, no, that's just an outgrowth. That's the part of the system that's satisfying a certain set of demands. Actually, Puelas himself doesn't actually interpret functionally. He's much too careful to go and speculate. He just talks about developmental fate maps in development of mouse across and several other species. And he just points out that if you see how this thing develops, this is just a huge mushroom that just balloons out of this one part of the hypothalamus and becomes this huge complicated thing.
Such a cool idea.
The nice thing about his model is that first of all, this was said in the 1800s.
You're kidding.
And in Wilhelm His.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yes, beautifully said. And Puelas is like saying, this guy had it all right way back then, right? But you know, for one historical reason or another, didn't catch on. But he's sort of revived that idea with much stronger data, really solid data. And the thing about it is that, you know, our brain really is a series of segments, right? And you can, and they always have sort of a dorsal portion which you call alar, and a ventral portion basal. Sort of the alar portion is more sensory, the basal is more motor. This is an old principle that's been out there, and he's just showing you know, that applies not just to the spinal cord, it applies to the entire brain. You just have to have the right map, and you see it from development, and it connects very well to evolution work, I think. So that's one person that has been very influential for me recently. The other one that's influential now is Sten Grillner, who, you know, many people know. You know, he's a superstar. I mean, he's Nobel Prize type. You know, I don't think he got one yet, but he should probably. He's one of the people that's really studying the lamprey, and I just can't believe all the things they've done. They've got those little monsters figured out pretty well. I mean, you know, the circuits, the development of it, the behavior of it, the electrophysiology, you know, and not just him. There's a lot of people studying him. He's
Right.
kind of the big name in the field, and he's doing always. He's always. It always seems that when I have a question to ask, it's just a matter of doing some more searches for something Brillner and his team have done. It's beautiful work.
And where's he out of?
He's in Stockholm.
Okay.
He's at the Karolinska Institute. I've met him a few times, but before I became a big fan. Next time I meet him, I'm gonna really chat about.
Now, you've been doing these series of lectures. Where do you get the best questions?
I have a couple of different variations of talks that very often the audience is like today, neuroscience, right? So I get relatively detailed questions about a particular paradigm and a particular region. Where exactly are we recording from? So those kinds of questions. I very often get the question. I very, very often get the questions like, well, okay, but what about higher thought? And that's a fair question. That's a great question. Usually I give an answer saying, well, I'm not really going to explain that. I'm not trying to explain that yet. I try to do that more now because I think, maybe you can speculate a little bit about how this thing evolves into something more sophisticated.
Well, but it seems to me it's a crucial part of your model.
It is actually. It's becoming more important, I think. I think it needs to mature, right? And actually, it changes. The model is changing a little bit. I had a slightly different mapping of functional relevance. I think now I'm seeing the prefrontal cortex not so much as a system that's biased in the competition, but it's just an extension of the competition up to higher order, which is really, it's an idea that's been out there for a long time, and I'm just sort of maturing my model to acknowledge that idea because I think it's right on. There's nice work, there's some nice functional imaging work, but as well as some primate neurophysiology that supports that idea. So it's difficult questions to get at least with single neuron recordings.
Yeah, but I think the thing that's missing from your presentation, based on listening to you now, is that actually you really care about those kinds of questions.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, I actually got into this because of AI, right? I was a computer science guy.
Yeah, I just heard you say that. I heard that.
Yeah, so I was a computer science undergrad. I was interested in AI, and I just became convinced that to understand intelligence, we need to know a little bit more about biology. So when I went to grad school, I picked a department that was really very interested in building models of the brain, not just machine learning or fancy machine, natural language parsers or vision recognition system, but really something just trying to explain the brain. And this was Steve Grossberg's group. And that's exactly what I was looking for. Very, very theoretical, quite speculative, but computationally sophisticated and scholarly. Like I had two supervisors, Steve Grossberg and Daniel Bullock, and both between them they've read everything. They really read the literature, they know the experimental work, and they can strain their models by real data. The models are still highly speculative, often very wrong, but still they're pretty good attempts they're constrained by real data. They make predictions, so they're about as good as you can expect from a model.
I heard a good quote. It said, "All models are wrong, but some are useful."
They're kind of like stepping stones, but just like stepping stones, you got to leave them behind after a while. And
right.
So,
and they should kind of be solid.
They should be solid.
Right.
Yeah, they should be solid, and they should lead you in the right direction.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. You don't want them to slip out from under your feet.
Yeah. So I think Grossberg's approach is a good one. The thing I found unsatisfying though is that we could come up with all kinds of solutions. On an afternoon, you get some idea.
Right.
Why do you believe that that's going to turn out to be right when you could have gone a different direction? As you develop these models, you could go here, you could go there, you go here, and then you go here, and then maybe you took a wrong turn, right?
Right.
And the only way to prevent yourself from taking a wrong turn is testing, doing experiments, right? And I thought to myself, well, I'm not going to. What kind of data would I need to test the kind of models that interest me? And in the end, it's neurophysiology. I mean, it's recording in the brain. It's the only thing that has the richness that we need to answer these kinds of questions. Mostly the temporal, because I'm very much interested in the temporal dynamics, how these things develop in real time during a behavior. And so MRIs doesn't cut it. Most studies don't cut it. You need to be recording in an animal.
Well, that's what struck me about your original paper. I was like, oh my God, 140 milliseconds. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Those timings are kind of critical.
Yeah.
Hard to pin down, but the point is that we can see the unfolding decision.
Right.
We can see, well before an action is performed. We can see the changes of mind that the monkey goes through.
Do you think you discovered the 140-second?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, not at all.
You were not the first?
No, this has been known for a fairly long time. It's actually more like 150,
Right.
I think, and it's a little bit different in different regions.
But it does come up a lot.
Oh, it comes up a
Yeah.
lot. No, but that's been known for a while.
Yeah.
There's a number of people. There was that really nice. There was a couple of papers that have come out in like the 90s that made that.
Okay.
The paper I cite, I think, is the best one from this. Is this Ledberg et al. study. It's been recorded LFPs throughout the whole brain. Showed this. We cite that in the review paper.
Now, is Glimsher, I haven't seen any of his recent stuff, or...
Well,
he's kind of funny because he's doing economics,
he's
right?
doing he's very much economics, but it's like my stuff. It's very much about action. Still, it is very motor centric in that sense.
Yeah.
He's asking questions that are not the questions that I'm asking, so follow them as much. Like Shadlin's, I followed more closely because we're
Anybody else?
in my field. There's the people in premotor areas and parietal areas that I follow. Larry Snyder was here. I don't know if you saw him. He was asking some of the questions, not too far from where Ilya was sitting. So Larry is great. He does a lot of premotor parietal.
There's some good work here, isn't there?
Yeah, this is a really.
I was surprised.
This is a really good.
It's a good place.
David Van Essen's one of the best medical schools in the country.
It really is. Yeah.
It's excellent. The neuroscience department has been excellent.
Now, I have this theory. I wanted to write a paper, and of course nobody would publish it, but I said, the best neuroscientists in the world are in Montreal. Do you think there's something about Montreal? Now that includes you, but there's also that woman who I love, Bridget. What is her last name? She does G protein receptors. Bridget.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Bridget Kiefer.
Okay.
She's French. I think her stuff is brilliant.
Well, I mean.
What is it about, though? Do you think? And this is me.
Well, there is actually a history of great neuroscience.
There with Penfield.
Well, and Hebb.
Oh, was Hebb up it? Hebb was up there?
Yeah.
Right. Penfield stuff is brilliant.
Penfield stuff is brilliant. And Brenda Milner, who's still there.
Lecture by.
This is the HM. There's some great history there. At U of M as well. We got Serge Rossignol. We had Herbert Jasper until he died.
It's so funny because it's
not tiny, but it's not Chicago.